audience you are. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Ed Behrens. I'm the editor of Apollo magazine, and I am thrilled to be joined by Ian Wardropper, the director of the Frick, who has been in that position for 14 years, though this year saw the announcement of his departure, as well as the completion of one of the most dramatic transformations of this beloved New York institution. We're going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then hopefully you will have throngs of questions for us as well. I think if we can go back to the beginning, Ian, when you started at the Frick, what were the challenges when you took over?
So I had a fairly traditional background in the sense that I was a museum curator for 25 years. I worked at the Art Institute of Chicago, and then I was chairman of the Department of European Sculpture and Decorative Arts at the Met. And I turned 60, and suddenly it seemed like a good idea to run a museum. And I thought it was going to be easier than it turned out to be. In my job interview, no one ever said anything about a building. And so I arrived, and I have a very beautiful office that's in the process of being transformed into a room that was actually Mrs. Frick's boudoir, so I no longer have that office. I've given up my office for the general good. But in that office, which had lots of cupboards, I started discovering blueprints in every cupboard. So there had been 4 previous plans, beginning in 1966, to build at the Frick. And I was totally unaware of that. And I think by the time I arrived, the trustees had kind of given up. So nobody said anything to me. And I might have left it there, except then I started confronting all the problems. And it's an old building that had been turned into a modern museum, but it hadn't completely gone modern. So I had to bring the Frick kind of into the 20th century, was kind of the way I thought of it. And we'll see now whether we can bring it into the 21st century. But so that was the challenge, was to figure out, how to begin a building. As I think many people know, the first building campaign ran into difficulties. I had an architect of record, Davis Brody Bond. They had done some work at the Frick. They had done a comprehensive plan. The Frick had a site that they had spent 30 years buying townhouses in order to build on, but they had eventually put a garden on it, and that became the focus of a lot of people's unhappiness. So eventually I had to withdraw that plan and start a new one. So, museum directors are never trained really to how to do a building. Hardly anybody in the profession is. And so I had the relative luxury of learning on the job. I'm happy to say this time around I got it right, with a lot of help getting the right people on board. And so I'm pleased to say we're going to finish this by the end of this year.
Which is quite something. Mm-hmm. So maybe we should cut to the chase on this building, since we've brought it up. What is it going to do for the Frick? What are you hoping it will bring from the audience point of view, but also to the old building as well?
So the original mansion was 1914, and then there was an expansion in 1935. And first of all, like any old building, it's falling apart. And the longer I was there, the more it was starting to fall apart. Things were literally falling from the ceiling. So the infrastructure was, if nothing else, what we had to address. So we're changing all the skylights, having the newest technology for glass, for lighting. The electrical system hadn't been updated since 1935. I mean, it had been kind of patched together, but barely functioned. The heating and air conditioning system was on its last legs. So all of that needed addressing. But the larger issues are the programmatic ones. And so the Frick has a relatively small but choice collection, one of the great collections of old master art in the world. But it had more than doubled in the time that we've been open to the public in 1935. And so the balance had shifted. Whereas we had most of the collection on view and relatively smaller amounts in storage, by the time I came along, there was more in storage than there was in the galleries. And we were fortunate enough to be continuing to collect especially some gifts from donations of really first-rate decorative arts collections. So we needed more space to show the collection, but we needed it in the mansion. The Frick is not a place that you want to build a brand new white cube to put art in. So the core of this project is to open up the second floor. Hence, I gave up my office that used to be Adelaide Frick's boudoir. These were the private rooms that the family lived in that was never open to the public, but have smaller scale. So they will allow us to show the material that we've been lucky to collect, which tend to be smaller scale objects, metals, things like that, in the scale of rooms that are sympathetic to them. And at the same time, I think it is a great mansion, one of the last Gilded Age mansions of the period. And the public has never really understood how the whole house works together. So for them finally, I was always very conscious as I put aside the velvet rope and walked up the stairs that everybody was looking at me and saying, who is that person and what is upstairs and why can't I go upstairs? So finally, everybody will be able to do so. Yeah. So it will knit the whole house together. So there's showing the permanent collection. We need a better special exhibition gallery. Our exhibitions have gotten better and better. I was very proud several years ago that Apollo magazine, I think it was for 2019, gave us the Exhibition of the Year award for an exhibition on Luigi Valadier. He was an 18th century Italian decorator, designer. But it means that we have more ambitious exhibitions, not larger. I think what the Frick has done well is understand and accept its scale. And so we've always done relatively small exhibitions, but really well focused and edited ones. And we will continue to do that. But in the past, our exhibition space, which some of you will remember, were down a circular staircase into two small rooms that were actually designed as seminar rooms. They weren't designed as exhibition spaces. So we could only show small scale objects. So now, by having it upstairs, we can have larger objects without taking down the permanent collection to show it. We'll have better conservation facilities to mount them. And for the first time ever, we'll have an education center. And I'm conscious of the fact that our head of education is here today, but the education department has done brilliant work with no space that was at their disposal. They always had to kind of beg or borrow a space. And so now there will be a beautiful multi-purpose room with natural light looking on the garden. There will be a reception place to meet students when they come in. So, those are some of the primary things, showing the permanent collection better, having a temporary exhibition space, having better education spaces. We are going to have a new auditorium, which is part of education, but we also have a very famous music program dating back to 1938. And the acoustics were never particularly good in this perfectly round room, and it was too small for our audience. So now, I was just down there yesterday. It's a very beautiful kind of ovoid shape, very warm and welcoming, which will seat about 220 people. We've just hired somebody to be our new music and program director. So I'm very excited about looking forward to new musical and lecture programs there. So, that's the core of it. I should also say, before I forget, that we have one of the great art reference libraries in the world. And this is something we will be able to engage our public with better, because it used to be that if you were in the museum and you wanted to go to the library, you had to go out the front door and walk around the block to get to the library. So now there will be a direct connection between museum and library. And it's important because scholarship is a kind of fundament of what we do. It's always been behind the quality of the projects that the Frick has done. And yet most people don't know that we have available to them a free library that's one of the best in the world. So that, I think, is maybe the last item I should mention.
Yes. So I'm intrigued by you saying that people don't know about the library and how buildings can affect sort of the identity of an institution. And always at moments like this, when a new building is unveiled, people begin to think about the organization in ways that they perhaps have not. And I'd like to pick up just on one other thing that you mentioned, which is that the acquisitions of things. I think in many people's minds, the Frick is this static collection of the paintings put together by Frick himself. So how does that work? How does an organization such as the Frick justify is perhaps overly strong a word, too judgmental a word, but prepare its acquisition to come into the collection in a way that makes sense for it?
Well, you'll have to restrain me because I've been thinking a lot about the Fricks as collectors, and I've just finished a book on the subject. But basically, we are a collection that was started by Henry Clay Frick. He actually began as a collector of contemporary art, which most people are unaware of. Starting in Pittsburgh, he knew artists, he bought local artists, then he started buying Barbizon School. And it wasn't until he moved to New York when he was competing with Isabella Stewart Gardner and Altman and Morgan that he really switched his focus to old masters. He dies in 1919, having done a brilliant job collecting, and as a very wealthy man. He knew what he was doing because he'd been collecting for 20 years by the time he started on Old Masters, and he had great resources. And then his daughter picks up the thread at that point, which is actually very interesting. She's left out of the story, so I'm trying to bring her back in. She was the head of the acquisitions committee at the Frick for 40 years, from 1920 to 1961. And just to say 1 year in her tenure, in 1927, she bought our Duccio of Christ tempted by the devil, and our great Ingres, Comtesse d'Aussonville, two of the great pictures in America in 1 year. But she also, she really focused on what she liked, and not necessarily what Frick did, her father. So she expanded the collection somewhat. In 1961, John D. Rockefeller Jr. offered a bust by Francesco Lorana and Verrocchio and Piero della Francesca to the Frick. Excellent items that related to what the collection had already. Rockefeller was a friend of Frick, he'd been a trustee, and Helen Clay Frick refused to accept them. And so the trustees and she went to war, and she sued the Frick, lost, sued again, lost again, and she left the board as a result of that. So those great objects came into the Frick, but it's important because that's the moment when she had always said the Frick should never accept anything that wasn't from the family, though Frick's will says nothing about that. So at that point, we could accept things from outside of the circle of the family. But the challenge of the Frick has always been quality, because we have a very high level. There's really no point to accept anything that doesn't fit and that we can't show. And so where we've been fortunate is, I think particularly in the field of decorative arts, we've gotten one of the great collections of Meissen porcelain from Henry Arnhold. We've been allowed to choose Dupaquier porcelain, that's Viennese porcelain from the Sullivan collection. Sid Knoffel had the greatest collection of French faience allowed us to choose. We are being given the finest private collection in the world of commemorative medals from Pisanello through the 19th century. And so this has been a kind of careful expansion of the collection, which, getting back to your point, having the second floor open now, available, and in smaller scale rooms, we now have a place to display these appropriately and I think beautifully. So that's kind of what we've been really focusing on, is how to display these things to their best advantage without changing essentially what people love about the galleries downstairs. Yes. When people walk in, I think sometimes the architect and I say to ourselves, well, we hope people will walk in and say, what have they done after 12 years and a lot of money? And the essence is we really want to, like this very beautiful room that we're in now, which they've restored very effectively. We want people to continue to love the space and think that it's little changed, even if we've refurbished everything. And the hang will change somewhat, but not very much. one of the things people love about the Frick is that we're not a conventional museum. So it's what looks good together in a dining room or a living hall rather than art of Italy in the 16th century.
Yes.
And so we'll maintain that, but there will be a number of subtle shifts, and the second floor will be, I think, a total revelation to the public.
So you mentioned the subtle shifts, and preparing for this talk, I'm sorry to say, been reading quite a lot about you, and I think what's interesting about your career as director there is there have been a lot of what seem minor and subtle shifts, but add up to quite a radical proposition. And in some of the exhibitions you do, in introducing all manner of programming things, and I wonder how does a director of a museum like the Frick in a famously conservative area of the Upper East Side, with a board which you increased the numbers of, how do you handle that? How do you effect that change? And how do you identify where you want to move the needle to?
It's all about the pacing, I think. It's more of an evolution than a revolution. And it's about also demonstrating that you mean it and that you can do projects of great quality. And then I think people will trust and follow you. I think even moving into what we called Frick Madison, there was a lot of concern initially. People couldn't imagine this old master collection in a Brutalist building, and frankly, neither could we. When I was initially, I was assuming, we all assumed that the collection would go into storage for the years that we were doing construction, and it was a bit of luck and a bit of negotiation on my part that we got this building, but then, how do we confront that? What I was really pleased by was that the curators, I think, did a brilliant job in thinking through how to organize and display it. The collection, many people said, "Oh, it never looked better," and this is partly because there wasn't a lot of competition. We'd moved away the damask wall hangings. It was just sheer walls and just the paintings or the objects. So I think people returned to remember how great the collection is. But the process of that, I think people responded so positively to the way that the collection was displayed there, that it gave them some more confidence that we would, when we returned to the mansion, that we would do an equally good job there. The thing about running an old master institution, and we are quite firmly limited in the sense that we are an old master paintings collection from 1500 to 1900. There is nothing that says we couldn't go beyond that, except that the collection is so strong and so clearly defined. It really doesn't make sense to exceed those limits. There have been some attempts in the past that have been rebuffed to go into the 20th century. So to me, the real question is how does an institution that is fundamentally about older art address a younger audience? And so we've been wrestling with that. And I think, my sense is that, it can be easy to say, I'm going to do a contemporary art exhibition and that will bring in a younger audience and make them interested in old master art. But I don't necessarily believe that works unless you've done it in a way that really creates an interesting and sympathetic conversation between today and the past. So that's part of the challenge, is to continue to do really first-rate work in old master art and publications and education programs, and to engage a younger audience in that. I still believe if you do a really good job, an interesting job, that it can work.
Yes.
And so that's the way to sort of bring the trustees and others along, is to be clear that we're continuing our mandate. But I think our tenure at Frick Madison has opened things up for us a little bit. Yes. We did some shows that were a little unusual.
Do you want to talk about Barclay Hendricks in any great detail?
Sure. This was an exhibition of a black artist who died about 7 or 8 years ago. One of our curators, Amy Ng, was looking for a topic of a contemporary artist, and Barclay was suggested. And the thing that we loved about Barclay was he was a huge fan of not just the Frick, but of Old Master art. Yeah. And we have videos of him talking about Rembrandt in front of the Whitney building. And so he had really closely observed Old Master painting and techniques, but he had a totally fresh, very contemporary 1960s, 1970s approach at a time when abstraction was ruling and figural art was really not the thing. Yes. And so it ended up being a really interesting show. I was worried how it would be received, and it was, his widow and his dealer were very supportive, and people like Thelma Golden was also really supportive in that. But I think what was also important about that show was we engaged contemporary black artists for whom Barclay is kind of a father figure now, because figural art has really come back into contemporary black art much more, and many of them look back to Barclay in a way that isn't perhaps generally known in the art field. And so that, I think, made it work for us, and it, we put it among our 18th century portraits, which he himself had studied. So, it's an unusual show for us. It was part of the moment, certainly. Yeah. But I think it also, signaled that we would be interested in taking on some projects like that we might never have done before. Yes. And, we have done, in fact, a series of contemporary shows over time. When I arrived, I sort of said, well, I'm not going to do that. And of course, I ended up doing a number of them. But we've done a series of exhibitions on contemporary artists who work with porcelain, for example. Yes. Arlene Chiquette, Edmond Duval, Giuseppe Pannone, all very much contemporary artists, but who have an interest in this older 18th century form of porcelain. And, so that was, I like kind of series of things that connect. Yes. So that's another example of something which we'll see if we continue that or not. And people ask me if we'll continue doing contemporary art shows, and I think it really depends. If we find the right show, we will. Yes. But I also really believe that we need to get back to doing Old Master shows in the considered way that we have done, because there are relatively few museums that will take it on these days.
Well, that's also something that's quite interesting, that not that long ago, the majority of shows at museums were Old Master shows, and that is no longer the case by any stretch of the imagination. So how does one safeguard that? How does one protect that space for an audience so that when they're ready to find it, they can?
I don't know the answer to that, actually. I wish I did. I think one just has to keep on doing really interesting projects, and projects of great quality. I love that the Met is, with all the shows that it's doing, it has this show on hidden portraits of the Renaissance. Large institutions can do both. Many museums are afraid that they can't, so they sort of may just go more towards what they think is going to draw an audience. Yes. In my experience, a younger audience isn't necessarily going to come just to a contemporary show. I think it's, there's some figures like Vermeer or Rembrandt that sort of carry weight and are known today. But I think, I do believe you can make it really interesting. And I think that's partly through education, through publications, yes, through lectures. I still believe in the concept of beauty. I think if we really show things beautifully, that also can connect.
Yes. So if we're talking about reaching a younger audience, one of the institutions who was most successful, I think, during the dark days of the pandemic was the Fricks. online offerings, including Cocktail with a Curator.
Look, there you have it. Yes, thank you.
Could we talk a little bit about navigating, balancing digital and bricks and mortar requirements, as it were?
It's particularly interesting in a museum that's has small intimate spaces where really it's all about your being in the space and looking at a painting. So how do you communicate that digitally? Can you really substitute for that experience? And the answer is no, but you really can reach people through digital means in a way that we hadn't quite realized. So most people, through your applause, I'm guessing that you know about Cocktails with a Curator, but essentially it was hatched.
Are we applauding the cocktail or the curator here?
It was hatched a month after the pandemic started. It started April 2020, out of nowhere. I mean, it wasn't anybody's idea, and it really came from the curators kind of talking to one another and saying to each other, what did they miss? And they missed sitting down and having a drink and talking about art. So this perforce had to be done out of their living rooms or bedrooms, because we couldn't, see each other in the pandemic. And we actually have a very good media team in the museum, which, I think most people didn't recognize, but the level of quality of production was quite high for this. And it just evolved. I mean, there was no plan. The first one was Bellini's St. Francis in the Wilderness, and I was talking to Xavier Salomon, and I said, well, you're going to do a Bellini, aren't you? And he said, no, he did it in Manhattan as a tribute to the city of Manhattan in the middle of the pandemic. So what I liked was, it had this twist, literally, which gave it a kind of lighthearted feel to it. But ultimately, what made that work was it was really very personal. And that gets back to being in a room in front of a work of art and sharing that experience with somebody. It's a personal experience, and I think that's what made the program work. It was not pedantic. It was really very straightforward. It was very engaging. Told stories about the history of a work of art and its provenance, or about the sitter. So we had 1.7 million views, which was astonishing to us for 65 episodes. And the chat panel was fun too, because before the program started, there'd be this little chat panel. There'd be people from New Zealand and Long Island and all over started saying, "Oh, is this going to happen?" And then during the program, is Xavier going to say this? And then he would say that, and they'd all be. So it became this kind of global conversation, which was really heartwarming. And so the challenge is that now our curators are very busy. We have to move the entire collection back. They're working on exhibitions through 2028. So there just isn't the same amount of time. It takes some time to put these programs together, as casual as they seemed. But we have an audience out there. So what do we do? How do we address them? And that's partly a question for the educators, partly for the curators. We actually have a series right now that's called Renovation Stories. There's going to be 20 of them. And it's in the dark time when we're closed at Frick Madison, but before we reopen back at the mansion. And each story is about an aspect of the renovation. So we've rewoven all of the silk damask wall hangings in the original rooms that we can. This was a budget line item that I really had to fight for, because it's expensive to do this. So we've gone back to Lyon, and in the great textile houses, they still had the original loom patterns, and they had the silk threads, which we had to match. And it took a couple of years to kind of get that right, and they've arrived, and we're starting to reinstall it. And then there's the passementerie, all the tassels that go to curtains, which is a whole other art form. So we've had these short stories about how that's done, how it's made, how the curatorial decisions that went into it, the practical side of how it's made. We've had interviews with, the owners of Prel in Lyon about showing the looms and how they're transferred from wooden looms to electronic looms. So it's another way of kind of engaging our public with the renovation, but the details of the renovation. Because I think people are still really interested and curious in materiality. How is something made?
Yes.
And that, we're interested in that and talking about works of art, but the building is a work of art in its own right. And so how do we get people engaged with that and tease them a little bit so they're really looking forward to our reopening?
Yes, excellent. So can we talk about one other aspect of the building that we haven't much, but featured prominently, I think, in your first attempt, was sort of the cause of the downfall, i.e. the garden, and Russell Page. And that's also being reconstructed with the same love and attention as the building, isn't it? That's undergoing it. So is that going to take a more prominent role in the position of the Frick thinking of everything as a whole? Has the role of the garden changed?
It's a good question. So we have three gardens, really. We have the Fifth Avenue garden, where our famous magnolia trees have been since the 1930s. We have a kind of winter garden, a garden court, as it's called, which was established in 1935. And then we have the Russell Page garden, which is 1977. And the Russell Page garden was always designed as a viewing garden. So it wasn't intended for people to walk into it. And the pool takes up much of the space. There's actually not a lot of room to walk around. But we've engaged Lyndon Miller, who's a very well-known landscape designer in New York City, to kind of advise us on that. Buyer Blender Bell is our architect, and they also are very much engaged with gardens. We have a horticulturist named Galen Lee, who's been working there since 1978. So we've had very good advice on bringing it back. And what we had to do was take up the entire garden, dig underneath, because that's where our new auditorium is, and we have a lot of spaces there, and then replace the garden, which is what we're doing now. And it's actually a great advantage to be able to do that. First of all, it always leaked. I was always a little embarrassed to say that, but it leaked into our art storage, which is directly underneath. So that was something which was never corrected, and we now can correct. And Russell Page, when he designed the garden, he died just a few years afterwards. He stipulated certain kinds of plants and flowers, which it turned out it was a shadier garden than he understood. Yeah. So not every species survived, and over time, a number of the trees grew too large, or storms blew them down. So this has been an opportunity for us to go back and study his original intention and go back more closely to find species that will thrive there that are close to what he wanted. Yes. And so along with that, we really want to celebrate the garden more. It is a kind of breathing space in the urban fabric, and the building is set off by the gardens that I've mentioned. And so though it made me lose a lot of hair in several years of the process of that first building project, I am very happy that we have the garden, because it serves the building well as a kind of natural foil. And not to mention that Central Park is across the street. But so we want to do more with the garden. We're actually in the process right now of looking for a horticulturist who would not only be a hands-on, literally, planter, but also will develop more programs around the garden. So bringing people into the garden, connecting the garden to art. My PR person will hate me for saying this, but one of our exhibitions that's coming up in the future is Fragonard and Gardens. We have the Progress of Love. It's all about gardens. It's a natural topic. So, that's a very obvious relationship. But in the same way that we're hiring a new music and programs director who will be doing music per se, but also connecting it to the art collection, I do hope that we'll be connecting the gardens to architecture and to art in ways which I can't imagine right now, but I know are there.
Yes, excellent. So we are sadly drawing near the end of our time, so I have two questions which are not totally unrelated. before we go to the audience. The first is, how do you hope people will look back at your time at the Frick? And the second, because this might help with the first, is what challenges will your successor face?
Well, I'm very conscious of being, I think I'm the 8th director of the Frick, so I'm building on the accomplishments of a lot of other people, and I've always felt that the important thing is to keep the spirit, the atmosphere, and the quality of the Frick intact. But I'm also, it's also very clear that if one is not constantly rethinking the institution, what it should be, where it's going to die and wither. So what I hope is that I've brought the institution through a difficult period. It's been difficult for all of us with the pandemic and with financial problems, social problems. I hope that I've left it in a good state with the resources it needs for the future. I think that we've continued to maintain a very high level of quality and imagination in many of the projects we've done, exhibitions, publications. So I believe that people will continue to look to the Frick for that kind of quality that it can build on in the future. I also hope that our time in Frick Madison has opened up people's minds to what the Frick can be a little bit, that they may be looking for different kinds of projects from us in the future. And so, my hope is, I'm 73. I wasn't going to say this, but I'm actually 73 today. Where would I rather be than here with all of you? My wife's taking me out to dinner later, so that's fine.
Thank God.
But it's time for somebody younger to come along, somebody tuned in to today, to make use of the resources and the sense of what the Frick is, to respect what that is, but also respect the fact that it needs to continue to move forward to address the future in a way.
Yeah, very good. Wow.
Did you ask me 2 questions, or was that 2 in 1?
I mean, I think...
that kind of did it? Okay.
I think that kind of did it. Yeah. I'm not going to press you on the challenges too hard. No, I think that's a good place for us to end. Thank you very much.
Yeah.